And speaking of which, you should see the thumbnail for this video.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so Gabe is the one who creates the thumbnails. And like if you've seen any of the like InkGuild stuff, like you know that his titles are like really something special. And this one, I think this
Oh
one's
yeah.
my favorite. It's definitely like the one that fits best with what we're talking about. Okay, wait.
Sweet.
Check this out.
Gotta run back to my phone. Oh man, as soon as you said Gabe and something special, I'm like, that just sums up everything about Gabe.
Yeah, right?
Something special.
I love him so much. Oh my god.
Me too.
He gives me so much shit, but like he cares. Hi friends, welcome back to the InkGuild podcast. My name is Dean, and joined today by Mark. How's it going, man?
Not bad, thanks, Dean.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming back. So, it's been a while since you've spoken on these podcasts, man. How have you been?
Good. Just a lot of work, a lot of school kind of thing, but hanging in there.
Oh yeah, it's been like for us at least who have been doing this pretty regularly. Like it's been interesting trying to like line up schedules whatever, but you know, we can talk about that later. Tonight we are going to be talking about historical fiction, which I guess is kind of a brief overview. Historical fiction are basically stories that kind of set themselves within a key moments in the past. I've heard that like for a decent or like for a good benchmark for historical fiction stories that it has to take place within the last 50 years or past the last 50 years or something, but like I've seen plenty of stories that go beyond from that. And like Mark, you are a history major, so I figured, you know, historical fiction would be something you'd be really interested in talking in, but yeah, I guess let's just start getting into it. So to ask the question to you first, Mark, actually, what have you kind of defined historical fiction to be? So like I know I gave the definition, but you know, what have you always thought of historical fiction being?
See, yeah, for me, the historical fiction that I've been exposed the most to is actually set drastically beyond that timeline. My favorite stories that I've read have been from primarily the Napoleonic era, and then also series from ancient Rome, and also from the time of Genghis Khan. And so for me, it was always just historical fiction was this creative interpretation of the past that just brought history to life and drew you right into it, kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the best historical fiction authors put you right there in that situation, and you're, you know, in that one moment you can live the history instead of just read about it.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get to some of our favorite historical fiction stories in a bit, actually, but I wanted to ask, since you kind of mentioned it, was it through books that you first started consuming historical fiction, basically?
Oh yeah, very much so. I started reading like classics and stuff, and then I don't even remember how I found my first historical fiction novel, but after I picked up the first one, I read that entire series by that author, and then started finding similar ones to dig into.
And you don't remember what the series is called, or?
The one that got me into it first was the Sharp series by Bernard Cornwell.
I'll look that up right now.
Yeah, they're real good.
Do you want to quickly explain what they are for people who might not know?
Yeah, so they're set in the Napoleonic Wars. Richard Sharp is the main character that you follow through the whole series. He is a British soldier who starts at the bottom of the military, and throughout the series works his way up through promotions and things like that with conspicuous acts of valor throughout the major battles of those wars. You get into the Spanish campaign. He found a way to bring him over to Trafalgar, which is a naval battle. We hear about Waterloo and things like that. The Indian campaign as well. So, yeah, it's set all throughout that period of warfare, focusing on this one soldier.
Nice. I like the covers. Or at least the covers that I'm looking at right now, the ones that's just kind of on like old style paper, and it's just text, maybe a weapon, and then just a little bit of a summary on it. Like, when exactly did you like when were you first exposed to these books? Like, do you remember how old you were?
Ooh,
if you don't want to talk about age, that's fine, but like
no, not at all. I'm just trying to remember. I would say 13, 14, in and around there. It was young. I mean, I've always been terribly fascinated with history, and specifically military history, so those were right up my alley.
Yeah. So it's interesting for you that it was through books, because for me it was through movies.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of historical fiction that I knew at the time, it wasn't even really like, I didn't even realize that there was kind of a term for it, which is kind of weird. But I mean, I was like 6, 7, so it was more like it was all just kind of movies to me. Some of the movies that I remember at the time, so like back before I was 12 at least, were I think The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. I think at one point I saw Gladiator.
Oh yeah.
And I'll get to that one in a minute, actually. And the one that I kind of remember, not vividly, but it's the one that sticks out in my head a lot, is Saving Private Ryan.
Oh yeah. Oh, that movie.
Yeah. So I remember being so fascinated looking back into the past, and like watching like a very Hollywood-esque movie of a certain time period. I think Saving Private Ryan in general, like that one was very interesting to me, because like I grew up watching and really enjoying a lot of war documentaries. So having characters to invest in, plot arcs that you kind of understand, like for me now at least, like it's interesting looking back into historical fiction. And I guess to pose the question to you quickly, actually, was it through like reading like historical fiction for you that's kind of made you love history and want to pursue it as a major, or like it's certainly like a big influence then?
Absolutely, yeah. I've always, like I said, from a very young age, I was always fascinated by history. I honestly think that was just from the time I could comprehend the information that I was loving history. The historical fiction made me want to go deeper than just the topical grazing that I had been doing up to that point. It made me want to dig in, learn a bit more about it, and even I was hoping to try writing some of it myself. I thought it was such a brilliant way of portraying history, and I really wanted to take a shot at it.
Yeah, to an extent you could manipulate, you could dictate what happens in history through your own hands, right?
Yeah.
Right, like it doesn't necessarily have to follow what actually happens in history. You can just find a moment and then insert your own characters in it or something.
Yeah,
which personally I've always found interesting. Like, sorry to interrupt, but like I've always found that really, really fun, because it's interesting looking back and like creating your own Nazi stoppers or something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
With that Bernard Cornwell, one of the things that that I loved the most was that at the end of the novel, he would always have a section called historical notes, where he
Mm.
would actually identify for you where he deviated from history. So, like, I can't remember which battle it was, but at the end, he straight up tells you, he's like, okay, Sharp fought with the 95th Rifles. There was no such unit. They didn't exist. I completely made that up because I needed Sharp to be here at this time doing this thing, but they never existed. And it was just, it led this sense of accuracy to it, where you're like, okay, cool. Like, I honestly feel like you've done a lot of research, and I could actually trust that a lot of what I've read is closely based on what happened.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that actually, because when I like talking about that, it kind of like my memory kind of jumped back to a book that I read, I think in my second year of university, called HHHH by Laurent Binet. I don't know if that's how you say it, but it's basically a historical fiction book on the assassination of Nazi leader Reinhard Heydrich, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so that one, and hopefully I'm remembering this correctly, but that book, Binet was talking about, he was recalling everything leading up to the assassination, like everything needed like going towards it, but at the same time, there were moments where he was stepping back and telling the author, like, okay, so I fabricated this for the sake of, like, for my own interpretation or something, which
Yeah.
that's an interesting approach to storytelling in general. But I guess with historical fiction, it probably makes a lot more sense to do it that way.
Yeah,
But
I think it's kind of important for really good historical fiction to identify where you manipulated facts
yeah,
to suit the narrative.
and I guess you know what? Let's put a bookmark on that right now, because we can talk about how to really write a historical fiction book or piece or anything in a minute, but I want to focus now on, I guess, some of our favorite historical fiction pieces. So like I say pieces, that could mean pretty much anything. So movies, TV shows, books, video games, anything like that. Like some of the more substantial stories within the genre that kind of stuck out to you in the last how many years. So I guess I'll start. Um, the one story that has stuck out to me, and I won't spend too much time on it actually, because I've talked about it before on a previous episode, but it is the campaign from Call of Duty Black Ops.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so the historical aspect of that is that it takes place within I think multiple, like, different time periods within the late 1900s. So there was the events during the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and some time, like, I think it was primarily between the Cold War, basically, and a lot of storytelling that revolved in that time period was the themes of, like, espionage, spies, um and to contrast that with the Vietnam War, there was a lot of, like, is it weird saying gun ho and you know like like blazing assault rifles or something? I'm like, because that's what a lot of thing, like, I remember a lot of, like, pre or like Vietnam War documentaries. They always focused on, like, it was a time for America, right?
Yeah.
And they portray those themes really, really well in the game. When it comes to the espionage, um and the more Cold War related sections, the game is very, very tightly paced. There's things that are withheld from you. You don't learn everything, but at the same time, there's an air of mystery around everything, that anything could happen, really.
Yeah.
With the Vietnam War sections, there, it's obviously, like, very high impact, very engaging. There's a lot of gunfights here and there, gameplay wise. And that's just one thing that I kind of enjoy about it. Like the characters too, kind of like they fit really well with the given time area. So Alex Mason, Frank Woods. For those listening at home, like I'm pretty sure you know who these characters are, but if you don't, like they really do suit the campaign that the game is set in. And like I guess playing through it, I guess playing through it just adds a whole nother kind of experience to it, because you're really living through this character's eyes, right? In a way that I think only really a book could kind of tell you, or a kind of book that could engage you in a way. Like, you know, you could tell a story through a movie and you could tell a story through a TV series, but like through books and video games, like there's so much interaction that you put in that's made it a very prominent historical fiction piece for me.
Well, that's fair. It goes back to what I was saying, that it brings you right in to be a player in that part of history, right? Like, you're not a passive observer studying it in a classroom. Like you're there. It's alive around you.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I heard about virtual reality starting to come into the world, one of the first things I thought was, oh man, that needs to be turned into historical fiction in a way. Like, that would be so cool.
Oh man, yeah, living through like a lot of pivotal battles from like storming Normandy, or I guess any event really in World War II.
Oh yeah. Cool. Yeah. So many.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I guess that's one of my first prominent stories. Mark, what's yours, or what's your first one?
One that really popped for me as a kid was the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson. It's set in the Vietnam War. It's you know, it's your typical Mel Gibson action film. It's gritty. It's full of blood. It's, you know, very yay America, of course.
Yeah.
But I remember as a kid being intrigued by that movie, just being like, whoa, this is carnage. Like, this is insane that people experience this. And then recently I was touring through the historical section of Chapters, and I found the book that movie is based on. And I had to buy it. I bought it and I read it, and like, oh, it's the movie is fairly close to what the book portrayed. It's I'd say a reasonable facsimile. And it was really interesting to watch the movie and read the book and kind of get the Hollywood version versus just this gritty, blunt retelling of what happened that day. It was fascinating and vicious all at the same time.
Yeah. So I'm reading through I guess the plot arc for the movie on Wikipedia. So it says in 1954, a French unit on patrol during the First Indochina War is ambushed by Viet Minh forces. I don't want to say the names because I'm probably gonna butcher it, but yeah. So it's set within the Vietnam War, which I think is a really interesting like time period for setting a movie.
It is, and it's a tough period to work with. It tends to be very, very polarized. It's either extremely pro-American or it's very anti-war.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the time period. There were only those two camps, and they were violently at each other's throats, both at home and on the battlefront. It was pure chaos.
Yeah. So which do you think this movie kind of falls into? Is it, you know, rah rah America, or is it, you know, the fuck are you doing? You can't do this.
The movie is so American propaganda. Like, I'm not panning the movie for anyone listening. I did enjoy it.
You're panning the propaganda.
Yeah, it leaves out a lot of stuff now, and that is because it was based off this single battle, right? and
Yeah.
it's telling the story of this grand American victory, but it leaves out the part where 2 days later there was a devastating, devastating American defeat. Like it's a good movie, but it's one of the end scenes is a little mini American flag on a shattered tree blowing in the wind, kind of thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
God, I love it. Thing on a side note, but like I love it when like American made movies are trying to end off on like a very patriotic note by like waving the flag. When
oh yeah,
nowadays it's like we know what happened, we can see
yeah,
through
right.
this.
Well, it's interesting. I was just saying to my girlfriend Carmen, I was like, just I can't even remember what set me off, but these days, what I'm reading, and what I'm seeing feels like America's finally coming to terms with the fact that they very much lost the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see that metamorphosis happening.
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting time we live in, anyway. But
Oh, in so many ways.
oh yeah. I guess speaking of which, in terms of so we're talking about like war movies. One of my second most prominent stories is a pretty recent example as well, and I adore this movie from its cinematography to its director to its soundtrack, um, to basically just how it handles itself, and especially how well it shows just how insane this time period was, and that is Dunkirk by Christopher
Yes.
Nolan.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I was so hoping that would come up.
Yeah. Well, you and I can bounce off of it, right? But like I love Dunkirk so much. It is, I think, in the running for personally my favorite Christopher Nolan movie.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think second only to, or like it's tied with Interstellar because I'm a fan of space. But
Fair enough.
yeah, like I think what Dunkirk really does best compared to a lot of war movies is that it shows just how insane everything is. Like I've already said it, but like you always have these insane like moment, or you always have these moments in, I think, typically war movies where the hero's gonna make it through, or the hero's invincible and they're going to save all their comrades and everything. But with Dunkirk, like everything that this movie like poses or like gives basically is, or it paints the best picture for me of how these soldiers must have felt in the moment, that they
Yeah.
could quite literally die at any moment, and that's
Oh,
terrifying. Like the gunshots that you hear almost every other minute, from this the sounds of like boots like trekking on the sand, like just eerie silence too, like moments where they're absolutely quiet is so
yeah.
like it like scared the living shit out of me personally when I first watched it, because I'm like, oh my god, like
Oh,
like
yeah.
yeah, the soldiers serving for this, they must have gone through a shit show.
Oh, the scene where, like, my favorite scene is when they're all just lined up on the beach, nothing to do. Half of them are just sitting, chilling, like, just bored and scared, and nothing's going on. And then you just hear the scream of the Stukas coming in.
Oh yeah. Oh my
Oh,
god.
that horrible, horrible wail that was deliberately installed.
Mm-hmm.
Ugh, just fearsome.
Yeah, like that's another like that's a huge thing that I love when it comes to movies, and that is sound design.
Yes.
Like properly timing sound effects, big impactful moments. Like that's a thing that a lot of people don't appreciate in storytelling in general, but like when in that scene specifically, when everything worked out, it was terrifying. Like it really gave the best kind of portrayal of just how dreadful that whole situation was. And I mean dreadful in the sense that like you quite literally were fearing for your life.
Oh yeah, constantly.
And
And
because of propaganda, they always say that, like, these soldiers were coming home brave and stuff, but like, look at how affected they were from all of that. They lost comrades, they suffered PTSD. All of that, I think, hasn't been more evident for me than in Dunkirk, because of just how well everything works.
Yeah, it was perfect, and they used the sound and the cinematography as a part of the story, it's what fascinates me about film, is the usage of the camera and the sound design to tell stories aside from the narrative, right? Like,
yeah,
no, that movie had no quick cuts. It wasn't like Taken, where there's 17 cuts to see Liam Neeson jump over a fence. It's just one camera watching this beach with no sound. There's just nothing. There's no music. There isn't anything. And it just lets that Stuka do all the talking. Yeah. I was just on the verge of joining the Canadian Naval Reserve when that movie came out.
Oh, really?
And me and Carmen went to go see it. And after some of the scenes on the ships, she turns to me and she just says, "When you're on the ship, you will always stand next to the exit. You understand me?" And it wasn't even like a joke. It was legitimately, she was telling me, "This is what you're going to do." Like, whoa. It was that visceral, right? Like, whoa, grand.
Yeah, that's nuts, man. I think before we move on to another thing, I wanted to give Dunkirk one more like piece of praise, and that is handling multiple perspectives.
Yes.
I guess in relation to historical fiction, Dunkirk, the movie takes accounts for 3 different perspectives, not necessarily from people, but from location. So so it takes what is it? It's been a while since I've seen it, but one location is definitely in the air, which by the way, oh my god, Dunkirk dogfights. That's some good shit.
Right, so good.
Yeah. But aside from that, so there's the perspective of the air, perspective of land, and perspective from the sea. And I think like for me personally, handling multiple perspectives, be it through people or from location like that, can be really, really difficult. But I feel like with the lenience that this movie gave, with not necessarily centering it on just a single protagonist, you had danger coming from every single possible way. And
very much.
Yeah, and that's what makes it, I think for me, like definitely one of my favorite war movies recently.
Yeah, it really encapsulated what Dunkirk was, right? It was very much a desperate struggle on the land, the air, and the sea.
Yeah.
And just thinking about the mechanics of everything going on, where there is so many points where nothing would be happening, but there's always the tension, knowing that something's about to happen.
Yeah. It's a chef's kiss. It's a chef's kiss of a Christopher Nolan movie, but anyway, so I guess if you've got a second story that you want to talk about, or a second really like interesting piece of historical fiction you want to talk about, then feel free to share.
Yeah. One more example. I was gonna discuss something by Conn, Iggulden, but we're talking about movies and stuff right now, so I want to mention this one, and it's some of Bernard Cornwell's work that isn't from the Napoleonic era. He actually has stuff from medieval times. And it was really, really fascinating to learn about how they actually fought back in those days. Whereas in the movies, there's the 2 massive armies, and they charge at one another, and they crash together, and there's hacking and slashing, and it's just
what series
brutal.
is this?
This is Bernard Cornwell's earlier work. For the life of me, I can't remember the name of the series anymore. It focused on Vikings.
Oh, I'm sold.
Yeah, it was super good.
Yeah, side tangent. I have fallen in love with Norse myth, with Norse myth and like Viking lore and everything. It
Right?
is so
It's fascinating
fascinating.
stuff. They were nuts, just
Yeah.
nuts.
So it's called the Saxon stories.
That's the one. Yes, yes. And they're really, really cool because they show you what combat in those days really looked like. And if you think about the movie 300, when they formed the big wall of shields,
I don't
and then
want to
the
think
other
about the
army,
movie 300, but I guess I get your point.
it's the best example I can think of for a visual right now,
Mm.
where they're all just sitting together, shields interlocked, and then they crash together and they just are pushing. They're literally just pushing on each other, while the second rank of men have short spears and short swords that they're stabbing over top or slicing underneath the feet kind of thing, all with the singular purpose of making somebody fall down. And once they fell down, the one army could push through that opening and break into the other army kind of thing.
Mm.
And that was what warfare was actually like. There wasn't a bunch of big noble charging or war cries, people flipping each other over shields kind of thing. It was just pushing on each other.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was fascinating as a kid to read that and be like, oh, well, that's just so different than what I expected.
Yeah. It's looks like an interesting thing. It's with the previous series that you said. It's got some really interesting really interesting cover art.
Oh, cover art. It's an underappreciated art form.
Oh yeah. Like I obviously cover art isn't everything, but like it really does help sell a book, right?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
First bites with the eye and all that.
Mhm. Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh man, I just love I just love Viking lore. It's so cool. How have I not heard of this?
Yeah. Yeah, check it out. It's really, really good stuff. He's a fantastic author.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So, so I wanted to share one more piece of my favorite or one more of my favorite historical fiction stories, and this one is, I guess, a little bit ridiculous considering how close to history or how close to time we've been staying, but I want to go all the way back to ancient Rome with a story called Gladiator.
Yes.
I love that movie so much, despite the fact that it has Russell Crowe in it. And that is very much not intent to disrespect or slender Russell Crowe. It's just that after starring in Les Mis, homie, I really can't look at you the same way. But yeah, Gladiator is, I think, one of the first few movies that really made me start taking it seriously. I guess due in part to, studying it for film class, but anyway, like after realizing like just how storytelling, how storytelling, cinematography, music, all of that works, I think more or less, I think it was just the setting that intrigued me. Like ancient Rome is hailed as a very prosperous kind of, I don't want to say utopia, but like it certainly was a very I don't know how to put it actually. Rome there was a lot of things that happened to Rome. But
so much.
Oh yeah. But with the story of ancient Rome, like the one thing that I always found fascinating about ancient Rome to this day, and I think it'll never be not fascinating, are the gladiators. I always found the concept of like people fighting to the death for the entertainment of others just wild to me. Like I guess I can look at it with more scrutiny now, but like as a teenager, it was like, holy shit, this is pretty cool. So I guess with the story of Gladiator, just how, I don't want to say completely dramatized it was, but at the same time it very much did feel like a Hollywood movie with, with the famous "Are you not entertained?" line. Like that is so Hollywood.
Yes.
It really reeks of like marketing and stuff, right?
Truly, truly.
But from like costume designs, like set design, cinematography, um I guess little things about the time period that works so well with the movie and really help benefit it. I think that's what makes it one of my favorite historical fiction movies. If not, I guess if not my favorite piece of media from that time period.
Yeah, it was a fascinating movie to watch. Like, and it does it engenders a lot of curiosity about the era and trying to wrap your mind around why this was entertainment, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's just such a savage period of time.
Yeah, but for I don't want to be too critical of a movie that I really, really, really do enjoy, but like like I had said earlier, it is a very Hollywood movie with a very handsome face, very like pretty clear good guy, bad guy origin stories, and the hero's journey is a very obvious story once you kind of figure out the beats of it. But that doesn't really take away from the setting of it. Like I know many stories have like told the hero's journey before. I know many stories um have had amazing cinematography. Russell Crowe's been in how many different movies? Same thing with Joaquin Phoenix and all them. But like, it's just how they approached it with ancient Rome that made it really, really interesting.
There you
No.
go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hooray!
Hooray! All right. So
What
maybe,
the hell?
man, I have been dealing with Discord shit for so long that
So this
suddenly when
happens in other
it's
sessions. It's not just me.
it's been fine like the last couple sessions. I don't know what's going on with it now.
It's because I have a technology curse. I really do.
Okay,
All
well,
of my stuff just breaks.
we're back now, and I guess before we tempt fate a little bit more, let's go to your final story, or let's go to your final story or your final piece of historical fiction that like you really, really enjoyed, or one that's really stuck out to you.
All right. Conn Iggulden. I hope I'm saying his name right. And his series about Genghis Khan and that era of Mongolian history.
Mm.
I think it's called the Lords of the Bow series. I believe, if I'm not mistaken. It is super interesting. The
Yeah,
first
Lords of the
book.
Bow. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, okay, cool. I remembered. Yeah, the first one tells the story of Genghis Khan before he was Genghis Khan, when he was just the son of a Khan in a disparate Mongolian tribe,
Mm.
and the shit that happened in his life that turned him into this absolute unit of warfare, that he just united the clans of Mongolia under a single banner and just went after the world. Like, and it's so engaging, it's so interesting, it's truly vicious at so many points. And
Mm-hmm.
I've researched it after the fact, and it is pretty accurate in its portrayal of that era. And well, it's just a part of history that I didn't know much about, and so to have it presented in such an interesting way was really, really cool.
Yeah, and I guess it's good to hear that, because with the story of Genghis Khan, it's really, I think, kind of overblown sometimes, or at least with the media that I've consumed. Like it's either glorified too much or maybe just not enough. So hearing that it's accurate is, you know, it's good to have a good representation of such an influential figure, for better or for worse, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's gritty, right? Like that's one of
Mm-hmm.
the things that I look for in historical fiction, is that gritty realism. of what these battles were like and what warfare was like at that point in time.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. That brings up a good point, actually. Or actually a couple of good points. So I want to explore one of them right now, actually. And that is pertaining to accuracy. Um, I guess to pose the question, how much do you personally care when a piece of historical fiction is or isn't accurate?
Um, for me personally, I don't mind authors taking liberties where they need to suit narratives and things like that. Like I've mentioned, I appreciate when the author identifies for you where they've deviated from the actual facts.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I go into historical fiction with the thought process that this is a work of art, not a work of necessarily academia.
Yeah.
And it's meant to be entertaining. And so there's a lot of suspending of your disbelief that has to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. To a degree, there are certain, it's particularly prevalent in movies, where, as we've discussed, they leave the realm of suspending your disbelief and enter the realm of romanticizing and playing up just the one part of the story
Yeah.
at the expense of the others.
Yeah. That's what I
I
wanted
don't
to
know
ask. Or sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a movie called Passchendaele.
No, I don't think so.
It is not worth watching. It is terrible.
I'll give it a.
And it's one of the very few examples that jump to my mind of Canadian nationalism run rampant in a movie. And there's this one scene where the guy walks into a tent and there's these two Canadian officers discussing their new part of the Battle of Passchendaele. And one of them says, well, of course they're going to send the Canadians in. We're the only unit in this whole place that gets anything done.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I was furious. I was,
That's,
are you kidding me?
That's egregious.
Right?
I guess to put it mildly.
So bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was livid. Like, yeah, we had a big part in that war. There's no denying that. It is fact that we had a part in that.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't the only ones fighting. And a comment like that cheapens the death of millions.
Yeah.
And it's so wrong. It's so terrible.
Yeah. I get that. And on top of that, like, I was going to mention that I agree with you. It definitely kind of depends on the story that you're telling when it comes to historical fiction. Like, you could either kind of take it more creatively or you could stick very close to facts. I think with my how do I say this? My, I guess, kind of main issue with accuracy is when it tries to really force the two to coincide. And
yeah,
and I don't really have a set example for this. I'm just kind of stating, but if there's one piece, if a story, be it however medium, tries to be very historically accurate while still trying to be creative with the storytelling, there's going to be such an obvious clash that I think would be evident that not just for historians but for storytellers in general, that it just makes it conflicting, right?
yeah.
Do you want to suspend your disbelief, as you said, or do you want to portray a very real, a very real scenario? Which, do you which one do you pick, right? You just lean into one or the other. You have the opportunity to do it. It's just, why don't you?
Yeah, it's a really thin line that you have to toe a lot of the times.
Yeah.
And I think it boils down to, as an author, deciding from the outset how closely you want to stick, like you said, make that decision between, do you want to be laser beam accurate with history, or are you just trying to tell a really fun story within a time period.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a decision that has to be made right off the bat. It drastically affects where you go with the whole story.
Yeah, like, I think the one time period that definitely, kind of finds a decent balance with it is World War II.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the sense that, like, there are plenty of, or there are plenty of pieces of media out there that take World War II in a more creative direction, basically, where, you know, they kind of adhere to some facts here and there, but ultimately it's their own story. Like the Wolfenstein games, for example, it's set in World War II, but it's not exactly World War II, right? Like, it's a World War II where the Nazis won and basically
Yeah.
took over the world. That's fine. That's its own historical, that's its own historical fiction piece of story. But when it comes to a movie like Schindler's List, for example, which I know,
Yeah.
weird comparison, but with Schindler's List, it really does take the seriousness of that era, and it portrays the danger of associating with anything that was non-Aryan very seriously. Right, there were multiple lives at stake, and you knew the impending sense of dread, or you knew the impending consequences through hindsight and through storytelling. So I think the one area that it doesn't necessarily get right, and you've mentioned this earlier, is basically whenever it comes to the US getting involved, specifically the Vietnam War. Like, we are, like, thing, you already stated it before, but, like, do you have a movie where it's so gun-ho and pro-America that it makes it fun, but then suddenly Americans didn't do that fucking great in the war?
Yeah.
There's such,
Well,
yeah,
that's the
there's,
thing, right? Like, it can be risky too. Like, if someone is only exposed to a certain brand of media in Hollywood, they come out of it with the belief that America did great in the Vietnam War, and
mm-hmm.
they were doing this noble thing. They were fighting commies and this kind of stuff. When in actual fact, it was basically 10 years of murder, straight
Yeah.
up unmitigated murder.
Mm-hmm.
It's it really depends on the story you're telling. You have to understand the gravitas of the situation, and like you said, like with something like Schindler's List, there are certain situations where you really don't take liberties, and you really don't want to deviate from the truth behind what happened.
Yeah. So then, to pose the question, um yeah, I guess to pose the question, just what makes historical fiction such an interesting genre to talk about and watch, or and consume, basically?
I think for a lot of it's hard to put a finger on it, right? It's like I said before, it's a lot of engagement with history and a lot of feeling like you're there living these drastic and critical moments of history, and I think that's such a huge part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other hand, it's I, in a lot of ways telling the stories of war that people want to hear, the success stories, the romantic stories, you know the noble parts of war. I think people are drawn to that stuff. It takes war away from being this horrific thing we do to each other, and tries to paint it with noble sensibilities that can help us to grasp the concept of war.
Yeah.
And in a lot of times, unfortunately, strays in the direction of almost encouraging it.
Yeah.
Not just accepting it, but being in favor of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the historical fiction that I know. Of course, there's a lot more than just military historical fiction. That's the world I've been the most exposed to.
Yeah.
There's so much more out there that I haven't read or experienced, but from my perspective, that's what historical fiction is kind of used for these
Mm-hmm.
days.
Yeah. And I agree with you. Like, it's definitely an interesting way of approaching history, especially very big historical events that have had significant outcomes for all of, for all of society right now, basically. And for me, what makes, to answer the question, what makes historical fiction such an interesting genre of storytelling is that it really provides like more creative insight into previous events. Like,
Yeah,
it's, they always say that the past and the past is the past, and or the past is the past, and you shouldn't, try to dip your toes into it. But like, I don't necessarily agree with that. I feel like for a storytelling perspective, there are so many stories that you can explore, from individual soldiers to, the setting of everything to, maybe you could just make up your own story, right? And people will be
yeah,
invested in it. Like, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be war stories either. Like, obviously, war stories have a very prominent place in, in modern cinema, video games, all that stuff. But it's even like specific time periods, like the Renaissance, the Dark Ages, the Crusades. So many, like, there were so many different avenues for storytelling. And one example that I'll touch on briefly is, or like, this one video game series touches on history a lot, and for the most part they generally do a good job of making each story feel interesting, and that
yeah.
is the Assassin's Creed series.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so the Assassin's Creed series has been through multiple different like time periods. Um there was there was like, the first game was set during the Third Crusade, I think. Um the second, third, and fourth games were set in generally within the Renaissance, and then eventually teetering into the middle, into the time of Constantinople. Then, then they explored pre-colonial, or like colonial America. Um, they explored the Caribbeans during that time. They explored they explored like industrial Europe or industrial Britain. They explored ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and this year they're exploring ancient Norway.
Oh,
Like,
nice.
there's so many different avenues that that history offers up in terms of storytelling, that, you could be a fan of the franchise, like you could be a fan of Assassin's Creed, or you could not be, which is unfortunately what I am right now. But like, I've always found historical fiction to be fascinating in that you could pretty much tell like whatever kind of story you wanted without being completely historically accurate in a given time setting. Like, if you were to just like write about a Viking during the times of ancient Norway, while incorporating some basic facts about, about how the people lived and like how they structured everything, people are going to buy into it. um you could write a hero's journey set in ancient Sparta, for example, and people will buy into it, so long as it's an engaging story. And, whether it's another war story or whatever, like, it really does go into what you said, that like, there's such a natural fascination with history, that being able to, I guess, repackage it and tell it in a new creative way makes it such an engaging piece of media.
Absolutely. It serves a really important purpose, right? Like, ask a lot of people what their least favorite subject in school was, and quite a few will say history.
Mm-hmm.
Historical fiction is able to transcend that. It's not this boring, dry lecture from a teacher at the front of the room when you're 8 years old and you just want to go toss a ball around.
Yeah.
It's engaging. It's presenting it to you in a way that makes you want more from it. And I hope, at least with good historical fiction, breeds a curiosity to know more about that period and the people who lived there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. it's definitely a thing. Like it'll, like we had just listed off what, like 3, 4 like respective examples of what we think is good historical fiction, but there's obviously many different ways of, I guess, not just like representing history but interpreting history. like like we had already said, you can be as creative as you want with your storytelling in a given time period, just as long as it's not too ridiculous.
Yeah.
I guess, like, there shouldn't be dragons and fucking like in the battle of Stalingrad or something.
Yeah.
Or actually, wait, they did do that. Call of Duty did do that.
I was gonna say we've got zombies in World War II, so
Yeah.
it can work.
Yes. Yeah. Like, I think there was even at one point, like, I know the term, or I know the book Pride and Prejudice and Zombies exists.
Yeah.
Like, people meme Shakespeare to no end, right? So you could set a story in Shakespearean Illyria, right? Like, there's so many, like, if you're ever like doubtful, or if you're ever curious about what to write, you could just look at history.
Oh yeah, you can just take a brief look around. There's inspiration everywhere in the past.
Yeah, like if what is it? You remember Jessica Farrell, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so she since I'd known her, she had been working on this one story called Darkness in Paris, where it's basically like a short story set during Nazi occupied France. Was France ever Nazi occupied? I don't know. But
yes.
Yeah, so
Very
it was set.
so.
Yeah, it was set during that time, and like she tells her own story. She has her own characters, and like the drama between those characters already is enough to kind of sell that whole thing, right? Like, you don't need to always have prominent figures within your story to make it a worthwhile read either. And I guess we're talking about now, like, how do you write a influential, or how do you write a good piece of historical fiction? And I guess my first piece of advice is just to lean into your creativity more so than facts. Like,
Yeah.
you don't always have to rely on you don't always have to have Hitler in your stories. You don't always need to have, gladiators in your ancient Rome stories. You don't always need to have, like, Leonardo da Vinci in your Renaissance stories. Like, just introduce good characters that fit the time period, and you're good to go. Like, that's a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with, again, deciding from the beginning what kind of what group you want to portray, right? Like, for a lot of different periods of time and focusing on certain groups of people, it doesn't make sense to bring in prominent figures from that time, or like, you don't necessarily have to have a bunch of big accurate facts kind of thing, as long as you're telling a good story that's true to the era.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, if you're starting to write something that you're going to be classifying as historical fiction, my starting point would be to gain some understanding of that period of time.
Oh yeah.
So I recently wrote that story, The Thief, the Crier, and Those Damned Dark Ages. And
I love the title.
Inspiration, right? Oh, me too. It's so much fun. And the inspiration came in the middle of a medieval history class at MRU. And I was sitting there listening to Emily Hutchison tell us about crime and punishment in those times, how a thief would have an ear cut off, and then they'd be pilloried in the town square. Yeah, right? And then they'd have a town crier, sometimes, not always, but they'd have a crier walking around calling out the crime that was committed by this person. And just that, the general understanding of how they viewed crime and how they viewed justice was enough for me to write this piece.
Yeah.
that was actually deeply satirical and critical
Mm-hmm.
of our current justice system.
Yeah.
That was actually its main focus, was attacking our modern day, utilizing the medieval ages.
Yeah. Can we go on a really 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 quick side tangent for just a couple minutes?
Yes,
How
definitely.
like I'm going to start off with the statement. Punishment during the medieval ages was so fucked. From my
Yeah.
understanding of it, it wasn't like I like I guess through like different videos and stuff, I learned about people getting like castrated, people getting locked in iron bowls and cooked basically. Like people like I finally figured out what hung, drawn and quartered was. That's disgusting.
Yeah.
Like there were people
Oh,
who
it
had
was.
like yeah, it's disgusting. It's so fucked and it's actually kind of cool.
Well, see, they actually had. There was a really interesting system of justice in place, where, from my understanding, was you commit a crime, you are committing a crime against the natural order,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the big thing back then, natural order, with God at the top, kind of thing. So
Yeah.
when you commit a crime, you are offending your fellow man, you are offending the king, you are offending God.
Yeah.
And so they would design punishments to suit that belief, and it could range. It could just be as simple as being thrown out of your guild, which in those days guilds were conglomerates of industry that regulated how that industry operated.
Yeah.
And to not be a member of it was to be doomed,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely doomed. And you couldn't enter into contracts anymore, which also gut punch, game over. And it was just this reflection of you've offended society, so get out.
Yeah.
It was just this weird kind of shunning almost. And then it ramped up from there to public embarrassment to, you know, the visceral and
Yeah.
vicious punishments that we all know so well.
Yeah.
And
The
all of it was
very
public.
yeah. Like it's all
It was,
for. I guess it was all for the people's enjoyment, basically, watching these fucked up things happen to people.
yeah, it was a
Which,
spectacle and a warning.
yeah.
If you step out of line, this is what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a weird time.
Oh yeah. And I feel kind of weird segueing from like medieval torture to another piece of writing advice, but um to kind of go off of what Mark said, yeah, definitely know your history. It doesn't thing like I don't really recommend that you should just do a couple of quick Google searches and then you're ready to write about, you're ready to write about like 1500s um South America or something. Like don't do that. Definitely do a lot more research. And I guess from my perspective, don't be afraid to ask, like don't be afraid to like really go in depth with your research either. It kind of just helps build a better picture of it, or it kind of helps build a better picture of not just the world that you are trying to encapsulate, but also it just help it make it feel more alive, basically. And this is coming from a fantasy writer that is so imperative on making sure that not every little detail, but like enough details help make the world feel real enough, right? It's
Yeah,
just different with historical fiction because all of this did at one point happen. So it's, I think, within the author's best interest to not necessarily portray that same thing word for word. Obviously, there's a lot of room for artistic or like authors' interpretations and whatever, but just understand what you're writing and write it well, basically.
yeah, it all comes back to world building,
Mm-hmm.
which is just a fact of story writing for any genre. You're always trying to build a world. And yeah, like you said, with historical fiction, you're grounded in this world and things that happened.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand the way things went in that period.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, like with any other bad world building, it won't feel natural and it won't feel real, and no one's going to want to read it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, if fantasy writers aren't going to tune into, like, to go off of what Mark said, if fantasy writers aren't going to tune into your world because it feels empty, then odds are historical fiction writers won't want to turn into your story because it doesn't feel alive enough, which is interesting because this at one point happened in history. So I don't know how you would be able to do that. But
blatant ignoring of
yeah, like
how the world worked.
Yeah, like if you're gonna write about the Renaissance, like know about significant changes that happened during it, right? Because at that point you are like part of a timeline. And even if you are going off an alternate timeline, like or if you're even going off an alternate timeline, like how they do in the Wolfenstein games, like there's still a lot of significance that you would have to include with your story, right? That you have to consider in context of societal roles, this and that, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, very much.
That's not to like that's definitely don't write in characters that are defying their like place in society, without considering the context of it, because odds are at the very least it won't work, and at the very worst, oh no, I can't even imagine.
Right.
You'll just stir a debate that was completely unnecessary, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're writing a story with someone who is defying their societal role, then you'd better understand what their societal role was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Like, obviously, when we're considering modern context, things have changed, but if you're writing about a story in the past, do consider that too. But at the same time, that's actually one final point that I wanted to touch on, actually. Even though you were looking back into the past, be sure to be mindful still of context. Like, context is super important when you're looking into historical stories. And Mark can elaborate on this further, but basically, like, if you're going to be writing like a very, and I know I'm delving into dangerous territory here, but if you're going to be talking about stories that involve, let's say, the N-word, like, make sure you're getting your shit properly.
Yeah. Oh, like, God, yeah.
Yeah. Or anything that involves very serious conversation, or very, like, anything that has to deal with very serious discussions like that. If you're going to do it, please do it properly and consider the context in which you're writing it. Like, do not ever just do something for the sake of drawing attention. Like they always say, bad press is good press or whatever, but like I think that's bullshit. Just be a decent person.
Very much so. And man, in this day and age,
yeah, like, be a decent storyteller.
Worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so the Thief and the Crier, it wasn't necessarily historical, I wouldn't say, but I did try to ground it in history, which became very, very awkward and very uncomfortable for me at one point, because I was trying to segue to a joke about the fall of Roman Catholicism in England,
mm-hmm.
in which the Crier makes a joke about, well, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to have one divorce and the whole Catholic Church is going to collapse, which is, of course, what happened.
Yeah. Oh, yikes.
But trying to segue to that point, I had to reference a bad relationship in the medieval ages. And so I wrote this passage that was uncomfortably patriarchal and misogynistic almost. It was horrible writing it and going back and forth for weeks trying to decide if I needed it in there. How could I soften it out so it wasn't as bad in the context of the medieval ages, which were horrifically patriarchal and misogynistic? Is this okay to say? Like, it's... Yeah, historical fiction can get really, really awkward really, really fast, and you have to make some pretty uncomfortable decisions.
Yeah. Which is why, like, it's certainly not a genre for the faint of heart. There definitely is, like, a lot more that, you know, like, you could bet that, like, a historical writer could probably churn out a fantasy story, but a fantasy writer can't nearly put out... I don't know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I'm just saying, like, my main point is that when it comes to diving into the past, you have to be mindful of context, and, like, context back then, context now. Like, you know, if you're going to be touching on very serious subjects that make you or could potentially make a lot of people uncomfortable, just make sure that if you're going to include it in there, be prepared for any kind of potential consequences that can come from this, because there have been consequences of these events, right?
Yeah.
Like,
absolutely.
Be prepared for that.
Yeah, and it's... A lot of history is very dark, very uncomfortable. And if you're going to set something in those times, there's, again, a really thin line that you have to walk, where you have to portray the reality of that time frame. So in the medieval ages, as very patriarchal, while not going too far, and just being misogynistic yourself in writing it.
Yeah.
And it's a delicate balance, and I don't know, that story got published, so I must have walked the line all right, but
yeah,
even now I'm still cringing, thinking that someone might read that and just be like, wow, you suck.
Yeah. It's like you didn't just get history wrong, but, you're just blatantly misogynistic or something, when, that's not the case. It's what happens as part of the story. It doesn't necessarily reflect your own personal beliefs, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it is just a fact of that period of time that this is something that existed. And it was very brief, one sentence kind of thing, one piece of dialogue. And I hope that I was able to portray it in a way that it was the reality of the time, but was giving the suggestion that this isn't okay. This isn't right.
Yeah.
And, like, yeah, it's just trying to make sure that you do that. That you present it and spin it in that way where you not spin it, that's the wrong term. Present it in that way where you are saying, they thought this. They really did. And it's not okay.
Yeah, it's like, take the modern context out of it and position yourself within the context of these people. Like, it can obviously be hard to do that, but when like we had already said, when diving into the past like that, you have to be mindful of, like, what's happened, how these people thought, how did people react to it, right? Like, as as, I don't want to say taboo, but, like, as changed as a society as we are now, like, we certainly didn't have clean roots, and that's what makes writing about, like, historical events both fascinating and potentially career ruining at the very least, but kind of life threatening at the very worst.
Yeah, it's easy to misstep, and you got to think. A lot of scenes take a lot of thought to try to portray them properly.
So yeah, just be careful out there, everyone, with writing historical fiction. Like, don't be afraid to write about one of your favorite time periods and set your own characters or whatever, but just make sure that you're doing your research and learn from I guess learn from your research, especially because that's what we as a society did after experiencing a lot of hardships, or at least that's what we're trying to do. Because under the state of the world that we're in right now, like history may not be completely repeating itself, but man, it certainly isn't fucking pretty.
Right?
Yeah.
Ugh. Yeah, it's when you're writing it, just I had a good way to put this, and now it's left my head. You know, portray the truth of what happened, but remember that what you're working on is contextualizing and analyzing history to portray that, yes, this was the reality. This was wrong. And think about how we've taken steps away from it and the work that still needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
That's the power of history.
Yeah.
It shows us where the missteps have been so that we can be better and learn to be better and remember that we've been awful. Just the worst kind of species on the face of this earth.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a lot of work to do, but you look back, you see those mistakes, and that's the way to move away from it. It's the way to build something better than we had before.
Beautifully said. I don't think I can kind of elaborate on that anymore, so I guess we'll wrap up for this episode. Yeah. Let's call it for now. So, thanks to everyone for listening in. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Let us know in the comments or by liking the video, sharing it, however you want to do it. Show us appreciation by, I guess, engaging with us. Quick thank you to Mark for joining me. I know life has been pretty hectic too, but it means a lot that you're still able to find time for the project. You can follow us on our social media below. Everything is down there, from all the InkGuild related stuff to our personal ones. And I think, as kind of a final send off, let's do something that I did with Gabe for his episode. So what he and I did for Cosmic Horror was that we basically we plotted down a premise for a Cosmic Horror story. So Mark, what you and I are going to do is we are going to plot down a potential premise for a historical fiction piece.
All right. Interesting.
It'll take some on the brain thinking, and we're not necessarily going to write the story, but we're going to introduce a character, setting, and whatever. So let's pick a point in history.
We've riffed a lot on ancient Rome. How about we go there?
Oh yeah, sweet. Okay, big question. Do we introduce the more mythical aspects of ancient Rome, or do we stick it closer to reality?
Ooh. A little touch of mythology is never wrong.
I agree.
Let's steer into that a little here.
Sweet. So let's introduce our main character. Could women had pretty strong roles in ancient Rome, did they, or did they not?
It was hyper patriarchy.
Okay,
so they were fairly relegated to the background.
Fucking patriarchy.
Yeah, right? Like brutal shit. But there were female gladiators.
Do you want to do the story on a female gladiator? Because that sounds badass.
Oh, yeah. We definitely got to do that.
Awesome. So, let's write an origin story. First of all, I don't want to spend how much time just looking up a name, so let's just come up with an origin story for this character.
All right.
What do you think? We can start with born to a slave family, or born maybe to a lower income family. A lower income. I don't know how it worked back there, but like a very poor family.
Yeah. Plebeian. We'll go with the plebeian class.
Yeah. Thank you for the term. I would have never known.
I recently had an ancient Roman history class, so I'm
Oh, that's
channeling
cool.
a little bit of that.
All right. So, with this origin story, let's say that if she's on her way to become a gladiator, who would be her mentor?
Well, she would have to have there were actual trainers. There were schools for gladiators. And that would be the only real way to do it.
Okay. So how does she find her way into the school?
Well, let's see. We're looking for some mythology here, so we could bring in. And I'm a little hazy on this part, so people don't crush me if I'm wrong. But we could have Mars, the god of war, step in.
Oh, like she's the chosen one or something?
Yeah.
That's a trope I absolutely abhor, by the way, but like
I know, I was just thinking the same thing.
Yeah. To add a little bit more creativity to this, how about that the god of war Mars supposedly marks a few children every 10 years or something.
Yeah.
So our protagonist is one of those 10 that are marked, and no one kind of realizes it because a lot of the kids before her and during it have been marked. They've typically come from higher households. Some people have even tried faking it, but they never would have expected a peasant girl, basically, to have been marked by the god of war.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I think in such a disbelief, they try killing her.
Ooh.
And so try to keep up with me on this because I'm gonna go by a little bit quickly. So, when her parents discover that she has been marked by Mars, they try to hide her away. But basically, let's say ancient Rome already knows that she'd been marked, so the parents just managed to sneak her out of whatever village she came from, but they die horribly. And now this girl is forced to live on her own. So either she finds her way towards the school directly, or maybe we could lean more into the fantasy by, I guess, exploring what happens between her between her parents getting killed, which is a pretty good setup for an origin story, or when she finally arrives at that school, because that school could be her moment of okay, I'm about to take back everything that ancient Rome stole from me. Yeah.
Going to ascend with fame and fortune.
Basically, if that's what she ends up wanting, right? It sets itself up to be a typical hero's journey, revenge cycle story, but I don't know. I'm kind of invested.
I know, right? It's good. It really is.
Yeah, it combines a lot of very familiar tropes, but sets it in our collective engagement, right? A female or an ancient Roman girl who was marked by the god of war has suddenly lost her entire life, and now she has to either fight back everything that or fight everyone that took that away, or be better than it, in a sense, and create her own legacy instead of resorting to revenge, right? That's, I guess, the overall theme.
Yeah, and that's the critical choice, right? That's that moment of where everything comes together for this character, deciding which path to walk down.
Mm-hmm. And that could be a pivotal moment too. She could be very much a very strong icon for the women of ancient Rome at the time, right? Because like you said, it's very hyper patriarchal. But if it's fiction, then it's oh, okay, yeah, fuck the patriarchy. This,
Exactly.
our badass is gonna take it all down.
Yeah, this is perfect.
Yeah. I think that's all I got though. In terms of like elaborating on it. Yeah,
it sounds like a great beginning for a story. It really does.
Yeah. I don't have the knowledge to do it, and I don't really have the time. So you're free to take the prompt from me.
I might have to try to walk this road and see how it goes.
I'd love to actually, like, if you actually do kind of entertain the idea and maybe write down like a chapter or something, please keep me updated. That's like it was fascinating talking about like Gabe's thing, and I'm so excited I'm so excited to like, entertain, or I love doing these little prompts. So before I think before we get distracted, or I think before we get further into distractions, let's actually call it for tonight. So yeah, thanks again everyone for tuning in. With all of this being said, we hope you enjoyed the episode, and yeah, have a good night everyone.
Thanks everybody.